seem to be working very well. Um, you obviously feel very strongly about the potential of the Mexican ports, port to build the new ports along the southern coast of Mexico and bringing intermodal freight up into the central part of the United States and bypassing some of your colleagues and friends out on the west coast and maybe even western Canada. Is that I presume that you're making big plans for the infrastructure to support that operation?
First of all, I don't think it's intended to try and bypass the ports that are on the west coast of the United States. I think that L.A. Long Beach is always going to be the preferred port of call for ships coming from Asia. What I think is happening is as you look at backup facilities that are needed to be able to handle the increased projections. And again, Asian traffic over the next 5 years is projected to grow at 10 to 12% compounded annually. And so there's a shortage of capacity on the port. So I don't think you're going to see any traffic that shifts from the ports today. But as what's happening in Mexico, around Mexico City and that area, there's about 55 million people there, and there's a growing middle class. So a lot of that traffic is going to come in and be consumed by those folks there. And what shipping companies like to do is to call on ports where they can, a lot of the containers are used locally there, and they can turn them and get them back and get better asset utilization. So I think that's one reason that Lázaro Cárdenas will be popular. It is shorter from Lázaro Cárdenas to Houston. It's a little shorter to Atlanta, so I do think you'll see some land bridge traffic. And we are spending a lot of money upgrading facilities along the line serving Lázaro Cárdenas. We've just entered into an agreement with the state of Michoacan to build an intermodal facility down there to service that. So we are going to be spending a lot of money down there. But again, it's not intended to take business away from anybody else.
Well, it may not be intended to, but it seems that, from what I read anyway, from what I gather, the folks in California don't really want any more intermodal facilities in California. They're finding every way in the world to stop them from being built. And where are they going to go if they don't go to Mexico? I dare say Mexico would love to have the business, love to have the traffic. And if they don't want it in California, it's going to come in somewhere. It seems like to me it's going to be coming in through Mexico. And the folks down there are pretty smart. They'll figure that out. That's all for the moment, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Mulvey?
Thank you. To return to finance for a moment, perhaps with your suggestions for a more holistic view of the scoring process might be taken up by CBO, so we don't have the same problems. But let me ask a question that you raised about what you raised in your testimony about this issue of leverage buyouts and private equity investment in the railroads. This is an issue that's been coming up more with increasing frequency lately, and I'd like to get all of your views as to what role you think the board ought to be playing when we do hear about a proposed private equity investment in the railroads that may have different goals than a railroad might have in terms of what you would do with the revenues and profits.
Well, let me, I think other than right now raising the board's awareness of these issues, I'm not sure what further role quite to suggest because we don't know exactly where this plays out. But it is a fact that in the past number of months, the railroad industry, and I think almost all of the companies in the railroad industry, have come to the attention of a different class of investor, or maybe a couple of different classes of investor than we have traditionally seen. And we come to that, come under their radar, if you will, because we've started in certain financial ways to show up on their screens that they run in terms of cash generation and things like that, and valuation and other things. there are two different classes of these folks, I would say. They're the big private equity funds, and then there are the so-called hedge funds. And they're very different in nature, although they favor certain financial strategies in common. The private equity funds, which we're all reading about, which now have enormous capital at their disposal. The amount of liquidity in the financial markets these days is just staggering in terms of the size of deal that's doable. It's certainly conceivable that any one of a handful of these firms could take a Class 1 railroad private. Their financial model is they take a company private, they look for either asset sales or improved efficiencies in some way or another, and they put an enormous amount of leverage on the company. Leverage that we would be in our public role very, very uncomfortable with. Having said that, there are two other characteristics that they have which make them slightly, I think, less of an issue. The first is they typically don't do this without the consent of management. You don't typically see a very large hostile deal in that world. And the second is that they have holding periods of 3 to 7, typically 5 years. So they can't, in effect, trash a company and then move on, because they have to then dispose of it and hopefully dispose of it at the same or a higher multiple. The second group are the hedge funds, and they are a very different group. Their typical model, they're much smaller typically, but their model is to come in and create a certain level of tension with management and the financial markets. I'll let others comment on the use of that word, with the idea of forcing companies effectively to lever up, to go borrow a great deal of money, to take their ratings way down. And you saw Jim Young talking about where the railroad industry ratings are today, but to push them down to junk or close to junk, buy back a lot of stock, rev up the excitement in the stock. Typically they're dealing with options. They have leveraged investments. They make a lot of money, get out, and then whoever's left is reviewing what has to be done. And that is a group, I would argue with you, that is not interested in the long term, who would pressure us to cut capital expenditures significantly, and they would be a very bad thing for our industry. I'll leave it at that and let the other folks comment.
I guess from my perspective, yes, what should the board be considering? And clearly, I think you need to look at the health of the rail industry. If you think about the general public, we probably have been a stealth industry. We move a lot of freight in a very efficient and a very economically sound, environmentally sound manner, but the public really doesn't think about us a whole lot. And unfortunately, the financial markets hadn't for a long time either, because of some of the returns we have. Well, we're now becoming of interest to the financial markets. I think from your perspective, I think ensuring that the role we play in the basic backbone of the infrastructure of transportation in this country that will be growing over time, I would want some assurances, should something like that happen where IU, that there will be adequate investment, adequate service provided to the communities with whatever groups might be interested in doing something with any particular company. So to me, that's the critical issue. How do we ensure that the role we play in this national economy is continued to be enhanced and not diminished?
I guess I would just add, I pretty much agree with what Wick said. I think what you should be doing right now is just kind of observing what's going on. All private equity groups are not bad. There's a lot of very good ones. All hedge funds are not bad. And I think you need to watch what happens. If I would tell you that if a private equity group or an activist hedge fund came in and the idea was to come in and just pretty much gut a railroad and load it up with debt, break it up, and eliminate competitiveness, you ought to be very, very concerned. But I think you would have to know that what the plans are, and I do think it would be important that the STB, if there is such a move, understand exactly what that investor intends to do with the railroad.
Yeah, that's the issue as to whether or not we should be taking prophylactic measures, or whether we should be responding to a leverage buyout once it occurs, and after we see what their intentions are. But that's unclear what our role is, and we're still trying to decide what authority we have to address a leveraged buyout of a Class 1, for example. I'll bring up a topic which I'm sure you're all dying to talk about, and that is the proposed tunnel project in New York City, Mr. Nadler's pet project. This is something which clearly would be very, very, very expensive, and something for where the benefits are largely benefits to the people of New York and the congestion and pollution in Manhattan. And yet, the only crossing of the Hudson River really today is at Selkirk, up by Albany. You've got to go 120 miles or so up the river, cross there, and then come back down again. And I'd like to get your views as how would a project like the proposed tunnel under the East River be best be financed? Mr. Nadler, I'm sure.
To be honest, I'm not extremely familiar. All I know is that it's quite an expensive project, and I'm sure if we ran it through the screens, we would, on our investments, we would probably choose as a private company not to make such an investment. If there are larger public benefits that might be garnered out of it, I think that's something that the public bodies have to determine, but I have to confess I don't have tremendous knowledge of the economics of that deal.
It was first proposed back around the time of the Civil War, so the price has gone up since then somewhat. But
and I haven't kept up with it since it was originally proposed. I'm like Michael. I'm aware of it. I think though you I agree with his point entirely. I think what it falls back to though is the earlier point I was trying to talk about. Which is in terms of investment in any kind of infrastructure in this country, and particularly rail infrastructure, you have to look at it from this holistic basis. What are all of the societal benefits that accumulate? And I think that there has been, if not a bias, certainly some level of ignorance in terms of what the benefits of rail are from a societal and public standpoint. I think the good news is that that's changing, albeit slowly. And I think part of our role and quite possibly your role as well is to, when this kind of conversation comes up, is to articulate the idea that these projects should be looked at as a whole for what they do for both the public and the private sector.
Kansas City Southern, when you had on one of your slides, was you pointed out on the RIF program, $650 million has been spent so far out of the $35 billion. I had asked the Department of Transportation how much of it was, and they weren't sure, but you put up there that in fact it was $650 million out of $35 billion. That does seem to be a fairly small percentage. My math is correct; it's about 2% of the total amount there. Do you look for the RIF program to play a greater role in transportation investment? And if so, how can we ensure that the RIF program does play a bigger role in getting the monies out there to finance these investment projects? Because clearly, up until to date, it has not played much of a role. Of that $650 million, at least 20% of that has gone to Amtrak, which is not a freight railroad. So.
Well, I think that actually the FRA is doing a good job with RIF, and we have been able to use it, as I explained, to rebuild the line between Corpus Christi and Laredo, and we'll also be looking at RIF loan between Victoria and Rosenberg. That's going to be $100+ million project. So I think that they've been cautious, and they should be, and a lot of material has to be furnished. But I just think that it's up to the railroads to go in and make their case, and I've certainly found that if that happens, that the FRA is receptive.
I guess to us it's just almost another form of financing, and we look at all capital the same no matter how you're making that commitment, and I think we still have pretty good access to some of the public markets for those sort of financing activities.
I think that's right, and I think we've also, probably fair to say we've been in the position, along with CSX, of being able to make most of the investments we need through cash generated from operations. So we haven't been quite as needful of that kind of investment or financing.
One last question. In my comments, I mentioned both the importance of human capital as well as physical capital. Both the NS and the BNSF, I'm sorry, both the NS and the CSX, you've expanded your employment, but the number of train and engine crew today is no greater than it was 7, 8 years ago, and it's been relatively flat. Do you expect that to be changing over the next few years? Do you expect to increase the number of train engine crews you have out there, or I mean, you have hired people, but it's pretty much been replacement.
Yeah, we've done quite a bit of hiring, and as you know, we opened a new training center in Atlanta, not only for our train and engine employees, but mechanical and engineering as well. I think we expect as we go forward, we'll see actual increases in our train and engine hiring as we continue to grow the business. As you know, that first increment of business, many times you can put it on an existing train and you're using the same crew and locomotives. But I think as we continue to see the demand for rail transportation going up, we will be running more trains. Obviously, we'll need more employees as we do that. And certainly, we're looking around many issues around work-life balance and adequate rest for employees. You know, if we can find some way to have regular time off for our employees, I think it'll improve their quality of life, improve their performance, and it may require some additional employees to get that better balance. So I think going forward, we'd expect to see gradual growth in our train and engine employment.
Mr. Bowman?
I think I'm trying to remember the numbers. Our T&E employment, I think, is up if you look at it over the past 4 years. If you look back, if you reach back a little further, I'll just point out the comparisons get to be a little murky because it was post-split in Conrail, and there were a lot of moving parts that were settling out. But I'd echo what Michael said, that our employment is growing. We expect it to grow as business grows. We're dealing with all of the same issues, trying to deal with them in the right way that he mentioned in terms of work-life balance and rest cycles and everything else. And our anticipation is that we'll continue to hire and train at a far higher rate than we have in the past.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just a couple of quick questions. I did want to just clarify that the board is not in receipt of any formal proposals about any investments or hedge funds or equity fund plans. But we get phone calls like you probably do from trade press picking up rumors and also reading articles, these interesting development that affects most directly the BNSF with the Berkshire Hathaway firm. It's been widely reported. You know, my first reaction is to say congratulations. If you're running your business well enough to attract someone like Warren Buffett's interest in investing 10% of your firm, you're probably doing something, you know, pretty right. So, but obviously we will ask the tough and appropriate questions if there was a certain transaction that required that, and you can be sure we're getting the best legal advice on that as possible, and especially for those railroads who have subsidiaries and relationships with other railroads and smaller railroads and short lines. You can bet we'll be taking an active look at how any transaction would be impacted and how it would affect the industry. But my preliminary reaction, at any time someone wants to put legal money into the transportation infrastructure system, is bring it on. But of course we'll ask the tough and appropriate questions as well. Turning to first, I wanted just to say, Mr. Moorman, that I don't know if you'll get any credit for this, but I think you should, in your effort to get the investment tax credit, the fact that the board and Vice Chairman Buttry has been, borrowing some of your infrastructure, as he announced this morning with the large piece of steel sitting in front of him on the dais. I don't know if you were here, but I think he rides the Manassas line of the VRE, which is where he picked up, I think where he probably picked up that piece of metal, and I'm sure if you ask for it, I'm sure he'll return it. But
I'm glad you pointed that. I was about to call the railroad police, but I guess that
I will say, as a
Good lawyers, go ahead.
as a rider of the other VRE line, and we'll hear from passenger rail folks later today, the Fredericksburg line, it's never occurred to me to jump off the platform and start picking up news material.
Please
But,
don't, Mr. Chairman.
yeah, I will resist any temptation. I do want to ask you, though, it's a little parochial, but it's important. It relates to what I kind of call from the highway perspective, but of course the rail line was there much longer. The I-95 corridor, the north-south corridor that CSX operates and owns. Incredibly important corridor to the nation. I know you have a proposal in with the Department of Transportation to receive some special federal funding to help with that corridor. It would do an awful lot to support the highway system. You've got to know well, just tell me where are you on that corridor as far as looking at improving it, and then more narrowly, I know you have one big project that I've been somewhat involved with from the congressional and the state side in past jobs at Quantico Creek, your new bridge project, how that's coming along.
What one I'd like to say, we did make the first cut on the project's corridors of the future. We're working now actively on our second level submission, and we'll see where that goes. But we're excited about that. But we talk about public-private partnerships, and there's a growing interest among some states to actually work to both increase freight capacity and alleviate traffic congestion and provide passenger transportation. And I certainly have to laud the state of Virginia for their attitude toward these things. As you know, they created a special fund of $23 million a year to fund rail infrastructure that helps both freight movement and passenger movement. And I think the current governor is proposing to increase that to $46 million. And I think we're going to see more and more of that growing over time where we work together. It's for us, a very congested. There's Amtrak, there's VRE, there's MARC, there's freight trains that need to move through there. It's a very busy piece of railroad, and I think that there's a growing recognition we need to work together to improve that infrastructure to meet everybody's needs. Is really the wave of the future as we go forward. So we're encouraged, and obviously it's always a challenge as you put the improvements in to make those things happen. It usually necessitates some delay. As you know, even on a highway project, as you're improving a highway, you usually make it worse while you're making it better, and I think we see some of that as we're improving the rail infrastructure. But I think we're very much aligned on how do we improve that and what are the things that need to be done, and we're struggling and working through the tough issues of where do you find the money to do that, which is always the challenge. It's interesting. The infrastructure in our country, not only just in rail, but if you look at cities with their sewer infrastructure, all of our infrastructure is getting old, and infrastructure projects are not real exciting to people. People like brand new things. They don't like necessarily fixing old infrastructure and making improvements to it. And I think there's a growing recognition we need to do that as a country.
Thanks. And any update on the Quantico Creek Bridge project?
I don't have the detail to give an update on that. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, if the flyer on my seat in the train is accurate, it's fairly soon. I think it's within 60, 90 days, and we'll look forward to seeing that. I know there are a lot of people in Virginia, including probably the entire congressional delegation, that looks forward to seeing that open up. It's important to the Marine Corps base there at Quantico. It's important to a lot of folks and the whole corridor from Florida up to New England. That's, as many of you know, that's been a one-track choke point in a very congested area. So it'll be great to see that opened up with really what'll ultimately be, I guess, a bridge that can hold 3 tracks. While I've got your attention, Mr. Ward, on passenger rail, obviously the CSX is, last time I checked, is the most impacted freight railroad when it comes to passenger rail operations, with all of your presence on the East Coast. How do you see, we're going to hear later today that folks in the passenger rail world and others forecast an increased demand, an increased desire for additional passenger rail. It's certainly something that I think is needed in this country. At the same time, as we're looking at all these freight forecasts and constraints, I'm just having trouble seeing how it all works. And you're right there in the bullseye, so to speak. Do you look forward 5, 10 years? How do you see this playing out? And as the owner of a lot of this infrastructure, do you see this as a money-making proposition for your railroad and your shareholders, or just an unfunded mandate? I'll pause there.
That's a nice loaded question. I guess if you look at it, I think we probably look at, for instance, I think we just segregate into 2, the Amtrak and then some local operations. I think we can find ways to work together. For instance, we've greatly improved our relationship with Amtrak, and we're now working cooperatively together to find ways to improve the service. But, and I really do commend Alex Cumming, because I think he brings an attitude of, I know that the freight has to move and the passenger has to move, because it's a network. Both have to work well to really serve both publics, and I think he's bringing a very strong, positive attitude. How do we improve both? And we're seeing some real progress there. When we look around the cities and their desire for commuters, that's a challenge, and we're trying, and we've actually changed our attitude some, I'd say, in the last 3 to 4 years. Let's try to find where we can creative solutions that work for everybody. To me, I would like to cite the city of Orlando. For many years, our rail line runs smack dab through the center of Orlando. We got skyscrapers on either side of us, and for many years, there's been a desire among the citizens of Orlando to have some commuter operations. As you know, it's very congested down there with I-4, and it's only growing over time. So we work with the State Department of Transportation. We have actually 2 lines that run through the state of Florida, and we said we could probably make that line available for your purchase and use during the day for commuter, and we'll try to divert our traffic over to the line we have running through the middle of the state, which we call the S line, if you'll help us build the capacity to do that. And to me, that's the kind of healthy private partnerships, because it accomplishes a number of things. Allows the city of Orlando to have their commuter operation. It allows us to increase our capacity on that S line for growth and to divert that traffic. And we're also working with the state to build an integrated logistics center down in Central Florida that the State Department of Highways is very excited about, because it'll drive the traffic down in containers into Central Florida, and then local distribution to Tampa, Miami, and Orlando. So many, many publics are being served, as well as our own private interest. So we found a good creative solution there, but the price tag of all that is about $500 million of investment in our infrastructure, and another $500 million worth of infrastructure in the commuter infrastructure around Orlando. So while there's lots of benefits there, there's lots of dollars to create those benefits. And I think that's the challenge we normally find, is people have ideas of how to do things, but coming up with the funds to do that is very difficult. I think over time, if we wanted to get serious about it, and I think our witness, Mr. Shane from the Department of Transportation, pointed out, people need to recognize, if they want good passenger service, it is not a money-making operation. There isn't a money-making passenger operation in the world. So we have to decide as a country that we're willing to subsidize that to provide the transportation for our citizenry. And I don't know that in all cities we've made that determination yet.
Thank you. Let me pause. Vice Chairman Butler, any additional questions? Commissioner Moldy?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Just have a couple brief ones. Bear with me. I appreciate your patience. Mr. Haverty, I hear often from electric utilities, as you can imagine, in a position such as mine, and it's not. This is not necessarily targeted to you, your railroad by any means, but you've been around a while. You have a good understanding of how the industry works, and it occurs to me there's at a minimal a clash of cultures, sort of business cultures. In the electric utility world, if they go, if they have an 80 or 90% performance record as far as when the lights are on, they're history. They're toast. That's just where they say that it's the norm for them to receive their coal shipments, at sort of the 80 to 90% level volume-wise amount, and they just don't. They tell me they don't get it, and they think something is just fundamentally wrong with that picture. And if they're held to a pretty strict performance standards and expectations, why shouldn't they expect their colleagues in the freight rail world be held to similar or even remotely similar expectations? And I know this is a question I'll let each of you answer. I'll start with Mr. Haverty.
Well, first of all, there are a lot of components that go into delivering the coal. From the mine, there are things that can happen there, and the railroads transporting it, and then there are things that can happen at the utility. So first of all, it's not all just a railroad problem. I just went to a meeting out in Arizona here about a month and a half ago, where the different groups got together, and it certainly is my sense, and I also participated in a call the other day, that things are going much, much better. Trains are moving more efficiently. out of the Powder River Basin. They're being loaded, other than the weather problem that was encountered in January. And it's my sense that the things are getting much better. And so I think perhaps what you're hearing may be some hangover of some things that happened back when there really were more capacity constraints than there are today. But I certainly agree that it's the obligation of the railroad to comply with the contract that it has with the utility. And in fact, in most cases, if you don't, there's some pretty severe penalties built into that. But obviously, the utility does not want the penalty; it wants coal. And I think the railroads have been doing a lot better job here recently. That's certainly the sense that I get.
Mr. Mormon?
Well, I'll concur with Mike in the sense that it is very literally a supply pipeline, and the railroads are one component of it, but not the only component. And there are certainly possibilities for things to happen all along the way. I think you're exactly right, though, about a cultural difference, and it was highlighted to me some months ago where I saw a press release from a utility. It wasn't a utility we served, and they were unhappy because they thought their coal deliveries were not timely enough. And the spokesperson said, "I don't know what's wrong with these railroads. We make our 12 to 14% return every year, and we're able to do what we're supposed to do." And it occurred to me that if someone were able to, by regulation, allow us a 12 to 14% return guaranteed every year, we might have a different mindset too. But we're not. We don't live in that world. We understand the essential nature of delivering coal to our utilities at Norfolk Southern. We work very hard to do that. I will tell you, if you talk to the utilities that we serve, I think you'll get a very good report card from how well we do. But we're going to continue to strive to satisfy our customers, because these folks are our customers, and that's what we're in business to do. And if there's a cultural difference, that may just be a difference that's there.
Mr. Ward?
Yeah, I think we actually have some both societal and economic issues there. As you know, most utilities, by their Public Service Commission, have the duty to serve to make sure when that switch is flicked that the lights do come on. And so therefore they keep tremendous reserves in place and are authorized to do that. They're guaranteed a return on that because we've decided that is the proper thing to do, to always make sure those lights come on. When you think about the supply chain for coal to fire the power plants, probably the better economic trade-off is to have those stockpiles, which they do, to give some flexibility for a little bit of unreliability. It's probably a better economic choice. Now, if they wanted complete 100% dedicated all the time, we could probably do that. They're willing for us to put in the infrastructure to ensure that 100% delivery all the time. My guess would be the economic trade-off would say you're better off with a little less reliability and a little larger stockpile than ensuring the 100% reliability.
Thanks. Just the last question for Mr. Ward and Mr. Mormon. I think it's only fair that with both of you here, and in view of the fact that we have the Virginia Port Authority with us later today too, tell me, are you well positioned to meet the Virginia ports of Hampton Roads and Norfolk area, their needs to grow and their need for additional rail capacity? And if not, what do you need from the Commonwealth of Virginia or the federal government to get you ready?
Well, I think we are positioning ourselves well to do that. I mentioned the Heartland Corridor project, which I think is a very significant project for a lot of constituencies, the port, the states that we travel through, and particularly the Ohio region, where we'll be grounding a lot of that traffic. As I mentioned earlier, it's really a poster child kind of project for a public-private partnership involving the federal level, the state level, and Norfolk Southern. We feel it's going to be an interesting project. We're going to have to go raise the roof on a number of tunnels and still figure out how to run trains while we do that. We'll have a number of engineering challenges, but we're actually scheduled now probably to start work in August. It's 2.5 to 3 years to get done, and I think we'll be very well positioned to serve the port and all of its constituencies.
I'd say we're very excited about it. I think we've seen great cooperation between us, the Norfolk Southern, and the port and the state. I think it's going to be a great project, and we're very excited about it. We see no real hindrances.
Okay. Vice Chairman Buttry, any additional questions?
I'm tempted to add some anecdotal information, but I'm going to resist the temptation about coal shipments. Maybe later the subject comes up again, my temptation will be stronger.
I can
For now,
assure
I'll
you
pass.
the subject of coal shipments will come up again today. Looking at our panels to come, I can assure you. Commissioner Mulvey?
I'm also tempted, but I just did an extrapolation, and this hearing should end sometime around 9:15. So no more questions.
This panel will be dismissed. Thank you very much for your participation. We'll call up now our next panel, Mr. Timmons and Mr. Hefner. Welcome, Mr. Timmons and Mr. Hefner. We're honored to have both of you here today. If it's okay, I think we'll start with Mr. Timmons representing the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. It's good to see you all, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss railroad traffic and infrastructure requirements from the perspective of the short line and regional railroad industry. While I know each of you is familiar with the short line industry, I think it is worth repeating that America's short lines have undergone tremendous change in the last 30 years. There have always been short lines, but today's short lines are far different than those of the past. They come in all shapes and sizes, some privately owned, some government owned, some traded on the national stock exchanges, some are members of the rail holding companies, some are large regional entities, and some are small family-owned businesses. Together, they represent a diverse, dynamic, and entrepreneurial collection of small businesses that have moved well beyond the traditional short lines of America's railroad lore. These are aggressive and agile companies. They employ a skilled, productive workforce and place considerable emphasis on training to be as safe as possible. They are aggressive marketers that fight as hard for single carload business as they do for unit trains. Today's short line industry was launched by the passage of the 1980 Staggers Act and by the federal government's decision that it was better to save light density branch lines than to abandon them. Your predecessor agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, played a significant and very constructive role in that new policy. Short lines have grown from about 8,000 miles of track in 1980 to nearly 50,000 miles of railroad today. There are over 500 short lines operating in 49 states. They keep thousands of local communities and small businesses connected to the mainline systems and have become the workhorses of America's network. They are the first mile, last mile team for 12 million carloads of goods annually, nearly 1 out of every 4 carloads moving on the national rail network. This interchange with the Class 1 railroads earns for those Class 1s about 18 to 22% of their bottom line revenues annually. I mention this brief history because it encapsulates our most formidable challenge as well as our most important potential. Both the challenge and potential relate to the purpose of this hearing, capacity and infrastructure requirements. The challenge stems from the fact that the majority of the track we operate today was headed for abandonment prior to the Staggers Act. These were light density lines that were marginal or money-losing segments of the Class 1 railroads, and as such, they received very little investment. While the short line industry has made great strides in upgrading its system, It is this huge backlog of deferred maintenance which defines much of our existence. Private and government studies place the cost of the backlog at anywhere from $7 to $11 billion. Today, short lines reinvest nearly one-third of their annual revenues in their infrastructure, higher than any other industry in the country. As the Class 1 system moves to heavier, longer trains and a more scheduled service, it becomes even more important that the short line industry maximize investment and eliminate the backlog as quickly as possible. The good news is that we're meeting this challenge. As the statistics I cited above demonstrate, we are a growing industry, and I believe we can make an increasing contribution to improving and expanding the nation's freight capacity. Today, short lines and regionals serve over 13,000 facilities that employ approximately 1.5 million workers. Together, they handle an estimated 12 million carloads of freight. For the majority of these customers, short line service is the only rail service they have. It would take more than 30 million truckloads a year to move the short line business. Let me use just one example to make the point. The state of Kansas has 2,000 miles of short line railroad. Those short lines move grain from rural communities to the Class 1 railroads. Without the short lines, that grain would go by truck, and according to the Kansas DOT, that would cost the state an extra $50 million a year in highway damages. Nationwide, short lines save $1.3 billion a year in highway repair costs. Now, I know that you've just listened to the Class 1s and that these numbers are small in comparison to them. And I don't mean to inflate their value. However, I think it is important to consider where we sit in the national transportation network. We operate in areas of the country that have no other rail service, and for those areas of the country, our ability to take a 25-car train 100 miles to the nearest Class 1 interchange is just as important as the Class 1's ability to attach that block to a 100-car unit train and take it across the country. Those areas we serve are not inconsequential. In 5 states, short lines operate 100% of the state's rail network. In 10 states, they operate more than 50%. 25 states, they operate more than 30%. And in 30 states, at least 1/4 of the rail network is operated by short line railroads. As just one example, in Iowa, short lines operate nearly 1,400 miles of track and move over 40% of all Iowa grain moved by railroads. These local railroads save Iowa farmers over 10 cents a bushel in transportation costs. And in your hearing announcement, you said that the board is called upon, among other things, to ensure that the development and continuation of a sound rail transportation system. And you indicated you want to explore the potential role of public-private partnerships and innovative financing tools in meeting the challenges. Let me very briefly and broadly mention 2 innovative public-private partnerships, of which one is working well and one is not. In 2004, the short line industry secured the passage of a 3-year rehabilitation tax credit. The tax credit provides 50 cents on the dollar for every dollar invested in our track infrastructure. Now in its 3rd year, the credit has been enormously successful in maximizing private investment in our infrastructure. As an aside, I want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Mulvey for the critical role he played in the passage of this credit. In his previous life, Dr. Mulvey was a senior transportation counsel to Congressman Jim Oberstar, the then-ranking Democrat on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and one of the acknowledged experts in federal railroad policy. Our tax credit legislation was successful in part because we were able to attract 268 House co-sponsors, more than almost any other bill introduced in that session of Congress. Dr. Mulvey took up our cause in that session of Congress and was personally responsible for recruiting a significant portion of those co-sponsors. For that, we are very grateful and want to thank him publicly for that effort. Because the 2006 tax returns are not yet available, I'm not yet available to provide a comprehensive set of data on the tax credit. However, I think a good measure of the credit's success is the commentary we are receiving from our shippers. I have attached to my testimony a sample of some of that commentary, and if you take the time to review it, I think you will see that our customers are not only benefiting from our increased investment, but are increasing their own rail infrastructure investments as well. In that regard, I would ask you to look at the individual letter I have attached to the customer stories. The letter is from the manager of the Dakota Prairie Ag, a grain shipper in North Dakota, and a customer of the Red River Valley and Western Railroad. The tax credit made possible a $3 million upgrade that allowed the shipper to finally participate in BNSF's shuttle train program for grain. Prior to the upgrade, there was a 12-mile segment on the short line that could not handle the heavier 110-car unit trains, and the tax credit provided $1.5 million of the $3 million investment. The customer writes in that letter, and I quote, "The more efficient service has saved farmers approximately 10 cents per bushel in transportation costs, or approximately $480,000 per year for all our producers. In addition, my company made a $2.5 million investment in our Edgeley facility that was needed to efficiently handle the unit trains on our property. So in 2006, a $1.5 million tax credit resulted in approximately $3 million in combined private savings and investment in North Dakota. I doubt there are very many government initiatives that can boast that kind of return," end quote. In an era when much of what we hear about shipper-railroad relations is negative, I think the kind of response we are getting from the customers on the short line tax credit is well worth your attention. Our tax credit expires at the end of 2007, and we are pushing for a 3-year extension. That extension is embodied in House Bill 1584, introduced by Congressman Pomeroy, Camp, and Moran, and Senate Bill 881, introduced by Senators Lincoln and Smith. While endorsing legislation may be outside the realm of the STB's responsibilities, there is one important contribution you might make to this effort. That is, it would be very, very helpful if you could allow Dr. Mulvey a short leave of absence so he could once again help us recruit co-sponsors for this legislation. The second item I would mention is the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Finance Program, or the RIF program as it is called. Now, this program provides loans to railroads for a variety of capital purposes, including track and equipment rehabilitation. It provides loans at cost of money to the government for 25-year terms. Short line railroads cannot secure this kind of funding in the private markets, and the program should serve as one of the most cost-effective public-private partnerships in the transportation field. These are loans that must be fully repaid. There is absolutely no cost to the federal government. The loans are secured by collateral equal to 100% of the loan value, plus the payment of a so-called credit risk premium that covers the risk of default. No short line has ever defaulted in the history of the program. Now, this program could go a long way toward funding the $7 to $11 billion shortfall I referenced earlier at no cost to the federal government. Unfortunately, it is not. Since the program was initiated in 1998, only 13 freight loans have been approved. Now, I'll not take your time today explaining all the reasons for this failure, and indeed, I am not sure that I fully comprehend all of them, for it is a complex process. However, I would say that if the board wants to make a positive contribution to enhancing effective public-private partnerships, it should take up the cause of exploring just why the federal government cannot make this program work. Now, I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts with you today, and will be pleased to answer any questions you may have at the appropriate time. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Timmons. We'll now turn to Mr. Hefner. Welcome.
Good morning, or maybe good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hefner, would you use
Yeah,
the microphone,
sure.
please?
That's better. Okay. By now, it's probably good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, and members of the Surface Transportation Board, and the members of the audience. And I'm getting used to wearing glasses. The print keeps getting smaller in the phone book every year. My name is John Hefner, and I'm appearing on behalf of Iowa Pacific Holdings, LLC, and its subsidiary Shortline Railroad Holding Company, Permian Basin Railways, Inc. I note that Iowa Pacific Holdings and Permian Basin are the only short-line railroad company that is represented at this proceeding today. I have previously submitted 6 pages of comments that describe IPH and its short-line railroad subsidiaries and present their views in this proceeding. But rather than merely reiterate those comments, I'm here to respond to the points identified by the board in its March 6th order scheduling this hearing. Specifically, the board asked participants to address freight traffic forecasts, the extent of capacity constraints, and the ability of railroads to meet that rising demand, the infrastructure investment needed to ensure that the nation's rail freight system continues to operate in an efficient and reliable manner, possible solutions to the challenges presented by growing rail freight traffic and limited capacity, and finally, the potential role of public-private partnerships and innovative financing tools in meeting those challenges. IPH, Iowa Pacific Holdings, is a growth-oriented short-line railroad. Much of IPH's traffic consists of merchandise or carload traffic, the traditional bread and butter of the railroad industry. And during the last 5 years of IPH's corporate existence, during the first 5 years, it's only 5 years old, of its corporate existence, its car loadings and rail freight revenues have grown by 371%. Even more significantly, using the retail term same-store sales, the same-store sales of IPH's first 2 railroads have grown by 130% during that time period. And looking ahead over the next 10 years, IPH believes it could increase its carload volume by 2 to 3 times conservatively. But IPH's ability to generate and handle more traffic is a function of its relationship with other carriers with whom it interchanges traffic, Class 1 railroads. And to the extent that IPH's 2 current Class 1 railroads have capacity problems for non-unit train carload traffic, those capacity problems could constrain its ability to handle the traffic that it generates. And to that extent, IPH endorses the remarks of the Union Pacific Railroad, the only major railroad whose written comments I've had a chance to read. Now, short-line railroad capacity is different from that of Class 1 railroad capacity. You see, most short-line railroads, IPH included, at best operate 1 round trip a day on their line, and in many cases it's less. We certainly have the ability to run more frequency on our existing routes if the demand is there. So capacity issues for short lines more often relate to yards and sidings, engines and rolling stock, and to qualified people. Short lines are railroads that do more with less. Creativity and multitasking are the norm, but any discussion of short line capacity necessarily segues into a discussion of limitations on the short line railroad physical plant. Many short lines, IPH railroads included, operate over a railroad network that has experienced a tremendous deferral of maintenance. In some cases, this infrastructure is simply worn out. Frequently, that was the reason why the Class 1 railroad owner decided to get rid of or divest the line in the first place. And even when the track and the roadbed may be acceptable, perhaps minimally so, there are large, high-cost items such as bridges or over major waterways that are 100 or more years old and are in serious need of replacement or repair. And these expensive items, these big-ticket, budget-busting items, are beyond the earning capacity of individual railroads to replace. When IPH acquired its 5 current short-line properties, it set about the task of locating and developing adequate funding sources to repair this track to an appropriate state of good maintenance. And with several of IPH's subsidiary railroads now on their 3rd and 4th owners, in other words, in the case of one of IPH's subsidiaries, IPH is now the 4th short line owner of that line. We have a continual pattern of deferred maintenance under each owner, and the task of rebuilding has become increasingly formidable. But IPH has risen to that task with a combination of state local, private, and hopefully at some date, future federal money. IPH has spent $10 million of its own money on fixing its track and right-of-way and equipment. And that has involved heavier rail, replacing ties, reballasting the railroad so that it can handle increasingly heavier cars and greater volume. Now, regarding the board's last 2 points, the solution for improving capacity to handle growth involves a mixture of funding and creativity. Short-line railroads can take advantage of an investment tax credit program for dollars spent, but that program is currently set to expire this year and is of little use, or perhaps even no use, to unprofitable carriers. And while IPH is profitable and can take advantage of the tax credit, flaws in the program, such as the alternative minimum tax that it has to pay, has significantly reduced the cash available to reinvest. But once short lines get that money, the innate frugality of short line railroad management teams will ensure that those public funds are wisely used. Now, IPH agrees that Class I railroads need similar funding programs for their specific needs. Now, back in the 20th century, if you'll recall the 20th century, this country came up with crash programs, no pun intended, to fund and build expensive highway and airport infrastructure. And now it's time to do the same for railroads. While the means of those programs may differ, the end result is the same: to put the industry in a condition to handle significant growth and future traffic flows. While I agree that short lines may be able to benefit from public-private partnerships and other innovative financial solutions, the problem is that many players in that field know so little about the short line industry, and perhaps even in the rail industry, that there is a significant and steep learning curve, and the need for capital investment is immediate. In closing, I'd like to remind the board and the audience that the railroad transportation mode is the only energy efficient, environmentally friendly, and respectful of precious land resource mode. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity to appear. I'm available to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hefner and Mr. Timmons. It's very good to have both of you here, and certainly the success and the growth of the short line rail industry is really one of the true success stories of the last 20 plus years in our transportation world here domestically, and you're both to be commended for your involvement in that. And Mr. Timmons, we've had a chance before to talk about your Virginia roots and your studies at the Virginia Military Institute. I used to be surrounded by VMI logistics and transportation and engineering experts, and in a previous job we've talked about. And some days I wonder if we just had a few more VMI transportation folks working on the problem, we'd be a lot better off. I'm glad you're on the job.
Well, there's no question about it. If we could just get more of those guys on the job, the problems would melt away.
Let me ask you, Mr. Hefner, you just referenced the need for, I'll paraphrase, but a national program or national investment strategy. Would you care to add to that, just, where's money going to come from? That's I think the question that a lot of folks want to know. I mean, I think we can almost all agree. I certainly talked about this earlier about the need for leadership, vision, a national role. But when it comes down to, where's the money going to come from? Would you share any thoughts you have?
Sure. And here I'm going to depart more from my IPH script and give you my personal point of view, because I represent several dozen short lines. General Timmons is right on about the RIF program. Everything he says is correct. That program was started roughly 10 years ago with a much smaller pot of money than it has now, and my impression is that they've lent something like $600 million out of $35 billion. Is that roughly correct?
The exact number.
I just have the numbers in front of me, but of that $650 million, $233 million went to the DM&E, which is mostly used for refinancing rather than investment. $100 million went to Amtrak. So if you take out that $330 million, then it was a little more than $300 million, all of which was invested, has been loaned since 2003. So.
Yeah. So I'd say, speaking just personally, maybe breathing new life and a new mission into the RIF program would be a good start, and making it less onerous. It's almost easier to get a private loan than a RIF loan, and a lot of short line applicants basically say it's not worth all the aggravation. We'll just go to our bank and we'll downsize our request. So that would be the first possibility. When I started in the short line railroad field years ago, there was a federal local rail service assistance program, which was basically federal money provided to the states on a federal, non-federal match. The non-federal match could be met by states, local governments, shippers, even the short line railroad could come up with a non-federal share. So maybe bringing that back in some form or another would be a good move. And again, speaking personally, some thought ought to be given to some sort of a rail transportation trust fund. The highways and the airline industry would be no place today without their trust funds. So it's not a matter of getting pork. If the rail mode is, as I believe it is, efficient, energy-wise, environmentally, land use-wise, then we have to have a government involvement in this. Certainly Iowa Pacific would like to do as much as it can with its own funds, and I think the fact that they've spent $10 million of their own money speaks well. There are other short lines that have also worked very aggressively, and I have to say, and I know that you'll have that Dave Ganofsky of the state of Maryland will be speaking in a little while. Maryland is one of a number of states that's really been in the forefront of providing money for railroad improvement. I would say that about half of the states are actively involved. Another portion of the other half have some involvement, and I would guess and say about 25% are in denial. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Mr. Timmons and Mr. Hefner may care to respond to this as well. Let's start with Mr. Timmons. It occurs to me in speaking to short line railroads and learning a little bit how that world operates, that business, very often the short lines are the ones closest to communities. You're in really, I mean, so are class ones, but you're in that first mile, that last mile so often, right in neighborhoods, right in, and